"This is not Islam" seems an ideal place to start a discussion of propaganda. It's a phrase one hears in the wake of each new atrocity, or in debates about ISIS throwing gays off buildings, and it takes various forms, but the assertion remains the same. Whatever happens, or whatever anybody says, it never has anything to do with Islam. Thus it is an ideal phrase for politicians, and makes for perfect propaganda. Let us imagine the consequences of a hypothetical scenario. What would happen if it were revealed that for various reasons, mainly due to business contracts and imperial power politics, that the situation of the Yazidis in Iraq had been deliberately engineered and financed by the West? Would a Western politician be able to stand up in public and declare, "We needed the Yazidis off that land. It's unfortunate that the women have been sold into sexual slavery, but that is of minimal significance, because an oil pipeline can now be built and the tax revenue will pay the yearly upkeep of 6 hospitals. Oh, and by the way, it has put the sectarian policies we've been running in the country on a more even keel. Vote for me!" Probably not. So along comes a spin doctor or a public relations firm with the suggestion that in this hypothetical scenario, the imaginary politician would be well advised to issue a statement saying this has nothing to do with Islam, because it doesn't. It's about money, votes, patronage and power. At which point, those outraged by events will rush to the interwebs with quotes from the Quran to point out that sexual slavery is allowed, and so is the killing of unbelievers, and so on. And they will be countered by people calling them Islamophobes, and so forth. And before you know it, the plight of the Yazidis is lost somewhere in the midst of the squabble. Equally, there will be a number of Muslim men who see this and compare their life to what those doing the raping and killing are doing, with all the fresh air and backslapping blokiness that entails, and they will hear "This is not Islam" in an entirely different context. To them, this is the Islam that they have heard about in the Islamic Golden Age, and no doubt from the more fiery elements from within their circle. The big difference between these people and those hell-bent on proving the politicians wrong and proving their propaganda to be lies is that those using the word Islamophobia as a reaction to these potential jihadis will be doing so as encouragement to make Islam great again, if you will, to make it feared. And so it's a win-win situation. The politicians get to use the phrase on TV without the telltale signs of lying being clearly seen in HD around the world. They also get a ready supply of new recruits for their mercenary gang of rapists and killers, should they need them for further land clearance. And to cap it all, they now have a group they can demonise as xenophobes and racists as a stick to beat their political opponents, plus the tax revenue for 6 hospitals and the corporate support from the companies involved. But this is all hypothesis, and should not be taken as anything other than tinfoil hattery, which is yet another benefit of propaganda. Anyone suggesting the propaganda has no clothes is a conspiracy theorist. Changing the subject slightly, in his excellent book In the Shadow of the Sword, Tom Holland quotes from contemporary sources that the Karajites would go out with their swords into the markets while people would stand around not realizing what was happening. They would shout, "No judgment except God!" and plunge their blades into anyone they could reach and go on killing until they themselves were killed. Which no doubt had the politicians of the 650s saying, "This is not Islam." And indeed, Ali, Muhammad's nephew and son-in-law, and founder of Shi'ism, did say just such a thing. He declared war on the Kharijites in Iraq and set out to exterminate them, with the result that after 3 years of killing them wherever he found them, a Kharijite assassin killed him while he was praying at Kufa. I mention this episode because in order for propaganda to be effective, it must obfuscate on more than one level. Thus the advocates of Islam is the religion of peace, a doctrine apparently first enumerated by the Grand Mufti George W. Bush, will be able to point to the Kharijites as not their kind of Islam. In any other religion, these Muslims would be seen as cultural or secular, but for reasons that most of us are aware of, even if many on the left willingly deny it, they will use the banner of "This is not Islam" to hide their apostasy from all the attached consequences. Curiously, the events in Aleppo have rather spoiled the propaganda value of the phrase, as the unwinding of the Syrian conflict, the release of the Clinton emails by WikiLeaks, and the election of Trump heralding a possible change of US policy has led to the rug being somewhat lifted. And the use of "this is not Islam" as a phrase had fallen into disrepute earlier in the year when, following the Nice terror attack, politicians who tried to use it were roundly condemned, in part because its sedative effect had worn off. Also, and this is the problem with propaganda, it may be having the exact opposite of its intended effect. Where once it allowed a suitable cover for economic advancement, the increased popularity of those determined to prove the causal link between events and religious ideology, which may broadly be seen in the rise of so-called populist movements, may perhaps lead to economic disadvantage in the future, due to rivals in the imperial game taking advantage of the backlash brought about by the new message. This has everything to do with Islam.